One of the tools at our disposal to understand what is meant by the word God is metaphysics. If we try to trace the historical origin of the term metaphysics, we would have to go back in time to the period in which Aristotle lived. But what metaphysics refers to precedes the life and work of the Stygian philosopher. What we are dealing with here can be described as the first principles. The link between them and God might appear intuitively obvious, but we should try to ask the question: how does metaphysics solve the issues that arise from our questions about God? Modern empiricism and religious dogmatism have oftentimes represented a hindrance in this direction. What is of most concern today, though, is the first aforementioned philosophical current, as modern consciousness seems to have built its own world around the assumptions of empiricism and materialism, which now are prevalent everywhere, even in the minds of religious people. Some of these assumptions lead to self-contradictory claims such as there is no absolute truth, which in turn lead to a further and more obvious disintegration and fragmentation, which we can observe in the deconstructive and skeptical tendencies of postmodernism. What has been lost here? We can answer this with a simple but very evocative word: the absolute. From medieval nominalism to the Enlightenment and the attacks on metaphysics from the beginning of the last century, absolute truth has started to be disregarded by the modern person as some sort of a superstition in favor of a falsely assessed notion of science, which unconsciously cuts its own epistemological roots due to its unawareness of how its empirical truth is also tied to axiomatic and thus unproven epistemological assumptions which have to be accepted as such without having any possibility of applying the scientific method to them. There have been attempts to overcome the issues which modernity, with its rejection of the sacred and with the death of God, has created, usually by the means of certain philosophies which are connected more or less directly to esotericism. We can see them in the total rejection of modernity in the traditionalist movement, or in the more synthetic approaches of anthroposophy, metamodernism, and integral theory, to name a few. If we want to return to the first question we asked, how does metaphysics solve the issues that arise from our questions about God, we would find out that modern consciousness doesn't have the tools to even begin answering the question, as it has completely destroyed them and thrown them away. This happened because within empiricism there is no distinction between the eternal and the becoming, the absolute and the relative, the necessary and the contingent. It's all becoming, it's all relative, it's all contingent. The correct metaphysical view doesn't accept this unbalanced perspective which empiricism holds, because the latter doesn't acknowledge that there is something which is essential. It denies transcendence itself, which from a purely empirical view is correct, but ultimately it is an amputation of reality if we try to conceive it as a whole. So, to answer the question, we could take different and multiple routes which would lead us in the same exact place. But, as we mentioned the distinction between the eternal and the becoming, we could attempt to do it starting from the temporal perspective. When we consider time, we can divide it into past, present, and future. What we can immediately observe is that now is always now, it's never in the past, nor in the future, and to these two, past and future, being can hardly be attributed, as you never say it is yesterday or it is tomorrow when trying to point to the present moment. When is the present? When is now? The uttered words fade into the past as soon as they come out of the mouth. This happens because we are trying to grasp transcendence itself with contingent means. Uttered words are a sequence of moments which happen in time, while the present is the eternal precondition that cannot ever be grasped, but which forever is. unaffected by anything that happens because it is just a necessary precondition for everything to happen. And if it were not for this eternal transcendent precondition, then everything would automatically disappear. If we understand that God is exactly this, then we'll start to move beyond the limits that modernity has erected to prevent us from gaining such insight. What was described here can be found in the religious symbolism which represents God. One of the most important symbols for God is the symbol of the center. We can see this center in the monad, one of the many symbols for God. The monad is a point with a circle around it. The point is exactly in the center, which is of extreme importance. If we borrow some notions from Euclidean geometry, we would describe the point as the first element which cannot be proven, but which has to be accepted axiomatically. The point has zero dimensions, which means that it cannot be truly represented. As being zero-dimensional, it completely transcends any representations, because representations must have one or more dimensions to exist. This zero-dimensional element transcends every other element, but it's a necessary precondition to all of them. Without the point there would be no line, no plane, and no cube, which are made out of infinite points, another very relevant and important factor. This is a paradoxical situation, but it is the foundation of geometry itself, which doesn't exist only as an abstraction, but it directly relates to the aforementioned question of time. To explain how this connection exists, we would just have to overlap the image of the monad with that of a clock, and we would see that the center of the clock corresponds to the center of the monad, which means that the point of the monad is precisely the present itself. How is it the present, one might ask? We would answer by saying that the center of the clock is that on which the hands are attached, so that what sustains them is always the central point of the clock. Every hand moves in a circle and points to a number. The number is a moment in time. So the center of the clock is what allows the hands to move and actualize every single moment in a sequence in time. Therefore, the center of the clock, being that which enables the hands to actualize a certain particular moment, represents symbolically the function of the present which enables every single moment in time. We can call the center or the point or the present the absolute, the eternal, the essential, or just God, while the circumference of the monad and of the clock is the relative, the becoming, the secondary, or simply the world. And if we look at how God is described by the most important religious traditions of the world, the attributes which belong to him are the ones which we can find in what we described earlier: transcendence, eternity, omnipresence, and so on. We could also simply describe him as the principle of being, or pure being itself, as it is synonymous with what we have said about him till now. If we start to grasp this view and internalize it, then we'll see a lot of connections appearing in regards to why certain spiritual, mystical, and ascetic practices are as they are, and why there is a common tendency to reject the world, reject contingency, reject what is secondary, reject unnecessary pleasures, reject passions which tie us to the world, and so on. They all try to lead to the center of the monad. They all try to reach God by liberating us from the worldly, self-devouring serpent, the circumference of the monad, because my kingdom is not of this world.